Right now, the United States military is losing a strictly mathematical game. Iran is deploying $2,000 Delta Wing drones to systematically hunt down and destroy $300 million advanced U.S. radar systems. Even when the U.S. successfully targets the very top of Iran's hierarchy, as it did in 2026 by wiping out the country's central leadership in a single night of strikes, the Iranian state refuses to collapse. They have built a system designed to absorb the most precise decapitation blows the U.S. can deliver. Instead of trying to match American firepower plane for plane, Iran has built a strategy of asymmetric retaliation. They bypass traditional military targets, threatening Gulf desalination plants and deep submarine internet cables. Look at this map. The Strait of Hormuz is a shipping lane with a navigable width of barely 21 miles, yet 20% of the global oil supply flows right through it. Iran sits directly on this bottleneck, holding the global economy hostage. Traditional military dominance requires a traditional target to destroy. Because Iran relies on cheap technology and physical geographic chokeholds, the United States is caught in a stalemate where conventional weapons simply cannot force a victory. In 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh triggered an international panic by nationalizing Iran's oil industry. He wanted to take the profits back from British corporations and keep the wealth inside his own country. The response was a joint CIA and MI6 covert mission known as Operation Ajax. They overthrew Mosaddegh, locked him up, and installed the American-friendly Shah to guarantee Western control over Middle Eastern energy. 2 decades later, the global financial system fractured. In 1971, President Richard Nixon abandoned the gold standard. Without gold backing the U.S. dollar, global trust in the currency plummeted. The U.S. desperately needed a new global commodity to anchor its money. This flowchart illustrates the solution they found. In 1974, the United States approached the Gulf states with a deal. Washington would provide absolute military protection for the royal families, provided all global oil was priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. This arrangement created the Petrodollar. To keep the dollar dominant, the oil had to keep flowing. To keep the oil flowing, the U.S. military was tethered to the Middle East, acting as the police force for the region's energy supply. In 1957, under the Atoms for Peace program, the United States actually gave Iran its foundational nuclear technology. American engineers built research centers in Tehran and trained Iranian scientists at MIT. That American proxy state vanished in 1979. Ayatollah Khomeini led a mass revolution, ousted the Shah, and established a fiercely anti-American Islamic Republic in his place. The resentment from decades of U.S. interference boiled over. Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. embassy, taking American diplomats hostage and cementing a deep structural hostility toward the West. A year later, during the Iran-Iraq War, the world watched as chemical weapons were deployed against Iranian cities. Iran appealed to the United Nations, but no one intervened. They realized then that if they faced an existential threat, no outside power would ever come to their rescue. By the end of the 1980s, the U.S. had inadvertently armed, trained, and then completely alienated a massive regional powerhouse. Iran emerged from the decade convinced it had to defend itself by any means necessary.
Tehran watched the 2003 invasion of Iraq and reached a grim conclusion. If you are on Washington's hit list and lack a nuclear deterrent, your survival is not guaranteed. That belief was reinforced in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi voluntarily surrendered his entire nuclear program to the United States in exchange for peace, only to be eventually overthrown and killed during a Western-backed intervention. For Iran, an American treaty began to look like a death trap. This gauge shows how nuclear security is achieved. Raw uranium is mostly useless. To generate civilian electricity, the critical U-235 isotope must be concentrated, or enriched, to around 3 to 5%. But if that enrichment process continues to 90%, you have weapons-grade material. In 2015, President Obama managed to stall Iran's progress. He signed the JCPOA agreement, lifting crippling economic sanctions in exchange for strict limits and 24-hour monitoring of Iran's nuclear enrichment. 3 years later, President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the deal. he reapplied extreme economic sanctions and triggered cyber attacks on Iranian centrifuges. Iran responded by ripping up the 2015 limits and rapidly accelerating their uranium enrichment back up toward the weapons-grade threshold. By repeatedly tearing up agreements and applying maximum pressure, U.S. foreign policy destroyed any remaining diplomatic trust. Iran calculated that the only way to ensure the survival of its regime was to push right up to the edge of the nuclear threshold. To survive a direct U.S. invasion, Iran followed its Mosaic Doctrine, dividing the country into 31 autonomous command provinces. If the U.S. kills the top leadership in Tehran, the system doesn't collapse. Every single province has the authority to keep fighting independently. They also weaponized their rugged natural geography, carving out sprawling subterranean missile cities deep beneath the Zagros Mountains. These bunkers are heavily fortified, widely distributed, and nearly impossible to track from satellite feeds. Beyond their borders, they built an axis of resistance. Iran heavily funded and armed proxy militia groups in Lebanon, Yemen, and Palestine, ensuring they could attack U.S. interests on multiple fronts simultaneously. These combined adaptations neutralize the core of the U.S. playbook. Because the command structure is decentralized and the strike capabilities are hidden beneath mountains, centralized air campaigns cannot force the regime to surrender. Today, the U.S. military bases scattered across the Gulf, the same bases built to protect the petrodollar, have become massive liabilities. They are sitting ducks for Iran's cheap, decentralized drone swarms. Iran has laid down a severe ultimatum. If the U.S. uses any Gulf nation's airspace to launch an attack, Iran will shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That would instantly paralyze the oil-dependent nations currently hosting the American military. Look at the cycle again. The U.S. is boxed into a geographical and economic trap. Abandoning the Gulf breaks the promise of military protection, which destroys the petrodollar and severely damages the U.S. economy. But fighting out of the Gulf risks triggering a global nuclear escalation. 70 years of constant American intervention built an enemy specifically adapted to neutralize U.S. military power. Now, the world's most powerful military is locked in a standoff where pulling out means economic ruin and pushing forward guarantees an unwinnable war.